You ever get that feeling like, the world's maybe operating on a different set of rules than we thought?
Yeah, like there's something going on just, beneath the surface.
Exactly. And
Yep.
that's kind of what we're diving into today. So welcome to your personalized deep dive.
We're here to sort of sift through the complex stuff, the head-scratching things, and hopefully bring some clarity, maybe find those aha moments.
Today, yeah, we're really focusing in on something that might seem, I don't know, old-fashioned, but could be incredibly relevant. Silver.
Mm-hmm. Silver as money, its history, its potential future.
Right. And all this set against a backdrop of some, well, pretty big potential shifts. Civilization, environment,
Mm-hmm.
the whole lot.
And we're drawing on a range of material here, including a YouTube transcript that features Clif High.
So the idea is to figure out how something like silver, with this really long history, how it might give us a unique perspective on what's happening, or maybe about to happen.
Exactly. So for you listening, this deep dive is about exploring that history. Like, why was silver so important? And why did that change? And what are some of these, let's say, speculative scenarios about its future, especially with, economic uncertainty, maybe even major environmental stuff?
Like an ice age, which is mentioned.
All right. We'll touch on that. And some of the more unconventional ideas that came up, too. It should give a pretty distinct lens on current events.
Okay, so silver is money. It feels ancient, doesn't it? Like something from a museum display.
It does, but the sources suggest it was way more widespread for much longer than maybe most people realize.
We're talking, what, Turkey, like 2,500 years ago? Maybe even
Over?
older?
Yeah, at
Yeah.
least that far back. And think about who used it. Athenians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, even way back, potentially Bronze Age. It was pretty ubiquitous.
What made it so useful back then?
Well, it had those inherent qualities, right? It lasts, you can divide it easily, and people just agreed it had value, intrinsic value, made sense for trade across different cultures.
Okay, that makes sense. But then there's this really wild idea in the source about the Bronze Age collapse.
Yeah, that is fascinating. The theory, and it's presented as a theory, is that the collapse of maybe two really important silver mines could have played a part in that big societal breakdown around, what, 1177 BC?
Wait, hold on. Silver mines collapsing helped bring down civilizations. How?
Well, the thinking is these weren't just any mines. They were supposedly key hubs for trading other crucial metals, tin, copper, that kind of thing, in Central Europe.
Okay.
So if the silver supply dried up, maybe the mines ran out, maybe something environmental happened, it could have totally disrupted those trade routes for the other metals.
Which would ripple outwards.
Exactly, leading to shortages, instability, potentially contributing to that whole era's collapse. It really makes you think about, resource criticality, our dependencies today.
It really does. Okay, so let's jump forward. Thousands of years, silver gets demonetized. Now, this wasn't overnight, right? It sounds like a longer process.
Oh, definitely not overnight. A drawn-out thing. You've got events in the mid-1800s like the Opium Wars, where the British were essentially trying to claw back silver. They'd spent trading with China for, silks and spices.
Okay.
But here's a less obvious connection linked to U.S. history. The Civil War.
The Civil War. How does silver fit in there?
Well, according to this source, the Confederacy was getting paid for its cotton by the British, paid in silver.
Okay. You didn't know that.
Yeah, and this flood of silver led to the South setting up these things called Dixie banks. They issued paper money, supposedly backed by this silver.
Supposedly.
Right. But these banks weren't stable, the paper money lost value fast, and the argument in the source is that this financial mess actually contributed to the Confederacy's problems and, was a factor in the war itself. It's definitely not the standard textbook take.
Huh. That's a different angle for sure. And then we get the crime of 1872, removing the silver dollar from mintage. What was behind that?
Well, the common explanation, and the one echoed here, is basically bankers, powerful interests who held a lot of gold, wanted the U.S. on a gold standard. Getting rid of the silver dollar, or reducing silver's monetary role, helped them consolidate control over the financial system.
So less competition for gold as the main money.
Pretty much. And this move towards gold just continued. Early 1900s, the gold standard becomes official. Then, 1913, boom, the Federal Reserve is created. Another step away from silver being central.
Right. It really makes you ask, like the source implies, who benefits when the rules about money change?
Exactly.
Well, silver's being pushed aside. But the source really flags 1965. Removing silver from U.S. coins completely, that's presented as a huge moment.
Yeah, it really is highlighted. Removing it from circulating coins in the U.S., The source uses pretty strong language like, first time since the beginning of man in the US context, that silver wasn't part of everyday money.
Wow.
Now, importantly, it also notes this wasn't global. Silver still had monetary uses elsewhere. But the narrative here is clear. Powerful financial players, the criminal banksters as the source sometimes calls them, wanted silver out to control the system.
Okay, so silver's been mostly out of our pockets,
Wait,
literally, for decades in the U.S. But now, well, lots of talk about economic instability. Could silver actually make a comeback?
that's the core question the source material explores. It draws a direct line from sidelining silver to the inflation we see now.
How so?
It uses the example of, say, a historical $20 gold piece. That used to be real, circulating money with significant buying power.
Right.
The argument is, compare what that gold coin could buy back then to what the equivalent face value in Federal Reserve notes buys today. It's stark. It suggests a stable metallic base might have prevented some of that value erosion.
And the source says we're in a similar kind of risky spot now, mentioning commercial real estate bond market issues.
Yeah, a potential commercial real estate crash, a bond crisis, and it explicitly mentions a severe metals crisis, potentially led by silver.
That sounds pretty serious. A silver crisis.
The perspective offered is definitely concerning. It suggests silver prices could rise, maybe catastrophically, hitting industries that depend on it.
Okay, wow.
And then, on top of that economic picture, the source layers on this other massive possibility, a descending ice age.
An ice age. Okay, that's a curveball. How does that fit in with silver in the economy?
Well, the idea presented is that something as huge as a shift towards an ice age would obviously magnify any existing economic problems massively.
Right.
It paints a pretty stark choice. Either our current empire, meaning like our control systems, our globalized structures collapses, maybe allowing for some kind of rebuild, or a more total civilizational collapse. It's the interplay between these huge forces, economic and environmental, that's really arresting in this analysis.
So if civilization did collapse, or at least transform radically, where does silver fit in?
The thinking goes, if centralized systems break down, you'd likely see a return to more local, maybe tribal or community-based structures.
Makes sense.
And in that world, with manufacturing potentially hammered, trade would probably rely more on tangible stuff, things with inherent value.
Like silver.
Exactly. Silver, maybe gold, maybe other metals, or trimetallic systems, or even just bartering goods directly. Silver's portability and recognized value could make it key again. It's like, in a crisis, fundamentals reassert themselves.
But the source also mentioned inventiveness, right? Like human ingenuity finding a way. That sounds a bit more hopeful.
Yeah, there is that thread of hope.
Yeah.
That maybe we adapt, preserve some aspects of civilization, even in a radically changed world.
Okay.
But it doesn't downplay the potential scale of the environmental change. It talks about serious glaciation in North America.
How serious?
Well, the exact extent, the location, that's uncertain in the scenario. But it makes the point that even seemingly smaller things, like big lakes freezing over year-round where they usually don't, could force huge, rapid population shifts.
Right. It uses current examples too, right? Like snow in Tahoe or port disruptions in Vancouver.
Exactly. To show how fragile our current infrastructure already is when faced with even moderate extremes, imagine something much bigger.
And the silver mines themselves, a lot are in Canada, Idaho, Washington.
Yep.
Places that could get hit hard by glaciation. What happens to supply?
That's a huge question the source raises. If those regions get glaciated, yeah, new silver production could plummet.
But would demand stay the same?
Maybe not. The analysis considers that population decline could reduce demand for some industrial uses, but then again, it suggests a potential increase in demand in other areas, specifically medicine.
Medicine. Why silver in medicine?
Well, the speculation connects to what the source calls medical malfeasance. The idea is if trust in conventional medicine drops, people might turn more to alternatives. And silver has this long history, as an antimicrobial, so maybe increased demand there. It's a specific but interesting potential driver.
It is interesting. The source also zooms out the global picture. Politics, economics, China comes up a lot.
Yeah, that's presented as a really critical piece of the puzzle. You have to factor in potential massive population changes globally and the knock-on effects. But specifically on China, the source describes what it sees as a major strategic shift. Basically, moving away from the kind of globalization we've known for decades.
Okay, what does that shift look like? according to this source?
It talks about China potentially limiting access for foreign bondholders, really focusing on building up its own internal market
Uh-huh.
and strategically hoarding resources, energy, materials, and especially food. It's framed as stepping back from that whole post-1972 Nixon visit era of globalization.
The one built on cheap Chinese labor, essentially.
Right, which the source argues kind of kicked the can down the road on earlier economic problems elsewhere. So the idea here is that China's strategic choices now could fundamentally reshape everything globally.
So the end of globalization as we know it. What happens to countries like the U.S. that offshored so much manufacturing?
Potentially huge challenges. Rebuilding domestic production is not easy or quick. And the source points to things like China's massive infrastructure projects, these ghost cities, even a separate stock market for its own citizens, suggesting this is a long-term play for self-sufficiency, maybe more.
More.
Well, it even brings up a pretty provocative historical reference, a supposed 1968 speech by Mao talking about needing North America's resources, sort of framing current actions in a very long-term, strategic, even adversarial light.
Wow. Okay. That's
Oh.
quite a claim. Bringing you back to the U.S. then, the source talks about a possible monetary reset here. What could that involve?
One scenario floated is a potential return to a trimetallic standard. Gold, silver, maybe even crypto integrated somehow.
What would trigger something that drastic?
Maybe a major bank failure,
Yeah.
something that forces a crossroads, another huge bailout of the current debt system,
Well.
or a radical shift back to something not based on debt, like a constitutional dollar, maybe backed by metals again. It really questions the sustainability of how things are structured now.
A debt reset.
Yeah.
The consequences sound enormous, chaotic.
Oh, absolutely. The source acknowledges it would likely be massively disruptive, but it also uses that phrase, creative destruction.
Meaning.
Like
Yeah.
maybe the chaos clears the way for something more stable, more sound in the long run. There's even talk of the government issuing gold coins again, reopening mines, even in places like the Grand Canyon, which sounds wild. It's a picture of dramatic financial restructuring.
It really is. And that leads into other potential societal shifts mentioned, like this idea of a public cleansing, removing bad actors.
Yeah.
That sounds intense.
Yeah, the analysis leans into potential social and political upheaval, a breakdown of trust in existing institutions, courts, hospitals, government, if they're seen as corrupt.
It mentions Kazakhstan.
As an example, yeah, of citizens taking direct action, suggesting that sentiment could spread. And tied into that is the risk of basic shortages, food, fuel, if these systems falter.
Man. Okay, this paints a picture of some really turbulent possibilities. Now let's shift gears a bit because the source took a turn I wasn't expecting, into the electrical properties of silver.
Yes, this was definitely a detour, but a really interesting one. It gets into the isotopes of silver 107 and 109.
Right.
And apparently there's something weird, even in naturally occurring electrum, that gold-silver alloy. When you analyze it electrically,
What happened?
the source describes it as showing a kind of missing something electrically, specifically related to the silver 109 isotope. Even though the weight is right, the molecular mix is right, something about its electrical contribution seems off. But get this, if you separate the isotopes, 107 and 109, they supposedly behave electrically exactly as you'd expect. It's only when they're mixed that this funniness appears.
That is weird. So what's the speculation? What does that mean?
Well, it leads into more speculative territory about silver being key for new electrics, maybe even individual power generation.
Like free energy stuff.
Not quite free energy, but the idea of maybe getting like 2% over unity, producing just slightly more energy than you put in, which, okay, sounds small, but scaled up.
Could be huge.
Right. And the source connects this to the idea that maybe efficient technologies sometimes get suppressed, mentioning the VW emissions thing as a sort of analogy for powerful interests potentially holding back innovation.
Okay, definitely moving beyond just economics now. But then, it goes even further. This dark spark of time. I have to admit, this part really jumped out.
It's definitely a shift into the esoteric, the metaphysical. The dark spark is described as like the opposite of time. An
antipode of time.
Yeah. And it's apparently mentioned in various old texts, esoteric writings. The source even says, be careful discussing it with the uninitiated, which definitely signals we're off the beaten path here.
So what is it supposed to be? What happens if you see it?
The claim is seeing it grants great power, maybe ultimate power. It's described as fundamental to reality itself. Like there's this constant pulse, 22 trillion times a second, apparently, destroying and recreating reality.
Whoa.
And the dark spark is what interrupts that pulse. Without it, the source suggests, there'd just be this constant consciousness, like Om Mani Padme Hum, no distinct reality. It emphasizes this binary nature, light and dark, time and its opposite.
Okay, my head's spinning a little. How does this connect to anything practical? Or even the other stuff we talked about?
It draws a line to ideas like the law of attraction, or even what gets called magic, the ability of consciousness or will to affect reality.
Right.
It uses Darth Vader's Force choke, obviously fictional, as a kind of crude illustration, like harmonizing with the dark spark to affect someone's physical antipode.
Okay.
Magic, in this view, is seen as just clumsy attempts to do that, often relying on physical stuff, rituals, because the practitioners don't really grasp the mental side. Real power, it says, is deep self-manipulation mentally.
This is wild. And then it brings in space aliens, the Elohim.
Yeah, this is where it takes a really specific and potentially controversial historical or even theological turn. The source posits that these beings, the Elohim, came here long ago. They had advanced tech that primitive humans, whose minds were supposedly in a degraded state in this yuga cycle, mistook for magic. And these interactions, it claims, became the basis for religions. It specifically mentions Judaism.
Wow.
And it suggests there's this Elohim worship cult anticipating their return, maybe around 2030, and that this is driving current events, accelerating agendas because their old magic has failed.
Yeah.
It's a very specific narrative.
So all magic, psychic powers, all that stuff is just lower level compared to understanding this dark spark.
That's the claim. And to see the dark spark, you supposedly have to touch the void.
Right.
Something called zazen might help, if your ontology is right.
Yeah.
Whatever that means precisely.
And if you do see it, what was the result?
The source says, no more fear. It all comes down to know thyself, conquer your inner enemy, victory over self.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
So bringing this all together as we wrap up, we've gone from ancient silver coin
Right, to why they disappeared from our pockets.
to your potential economic collapse, maybe an ice age,
Global power shifts, China's role.
and then into these really deep, strange corners about silver's properties and the fundamental nature of reality, this dark spark idea.
Yeah, it's quite a journey through the source material. The goal was really to connect these dots, even the surprising ones, to give you that deeper, maybe more challenging perspective.
So the question for you, listening, is, what do you make of all this? The long story of silver, the potential fragility of our systems, these hints of hidden dimensions. Does it change how you see things?
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. We encourage you to keep digging into these ideas yourself. What does this mix of history, speculation, and the truly esoteric mean for how you understand today and maybe tomorrow?